Welcome to the program tonight, part two of my conversation with Vladimir Putin.
You know, as I said, sanctions are illegal actions which violate the principles of the world economy, the principles of the WTO, the United Nations, because sanctions can be introduced only by the decision of the UN Security Council, because unilaterally that is a violation of international law.
And an analysis of the Russian president's visit to the United Nations with Stephen Lee Myers, Margaret Brennan, Carol Lee, and Neil Ferguson.
What you're seeing now is what Russia's intervention is and moves in Syria has forced them to do is to bring this under one full umbrella and try to come up with some sort of comprehensive strategy, which is what the president's critics have been calling for him to do for quite some time.
A conversation with Vladimir Putin and an analysis of his visit to the UNGA when we continue.
From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Tonight, part two of our conversation with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. It took place on September 20th in Moscow. We talked of many things. He gave us an opportunity to have an engaging conversation about him and how he sees Russia and Russia's role in the world. He also gave us an opportunity to have a further conversation after the interview when he invited us in for appetizers, which turned into dinner, and that was a further consideration of all the topics we've been talking about. But now, the conversation followed by an analysis of his visit to the United States. Are people in Russia fearful of you?
Думаю, что нет.
I think not.
Я исхожу из того, что большинство людей мне доверяет.
I proceed from the fact that most people trust me if they vote for me at the election. And this is the most important thing. It places enormous responsibility on me, colossal. And I'm grateful to people for this trust, but at the same time, I feel this huge burden of responsibility for doing what I do and for the results of my work.
Well, as you know, in America, you're much talked about in America. There's much conversation, more so than any...
Maybe they have nothing else to do in America but to talk about.
No, or maybe they're curious people. Or maybe you're an interesting character. Maybe that's what it is. But they see this, first of all, a strong leader who presents himself in a strong way. They know of a former KGB agent who came back and got into politics in St. Petersburg and became deputy mayor and then came to Moscow. And the interesting thing is they see these images of you bare-chested on a horse, and they say, there is a man who carefully cultivates his image of strength. I'm asking...
Знаете, мне кажется, что...
You know, I'm convinced that a person who occupies my post must provide a positive example to people. And those areas where he can do this, he's obligated to do this.
В тех областях, где он может делать это, он делать это обязан.
In our country, in the 1990s and early 2000s, we had a very severe situation with the social sphere. The social security system was destroyed. A lot of problems emerged that we still, to this day, cannot effectively resolve fully. In the sphere of healthcare, in the development of sports, and I think that a healthy lifestyle is extremely important.
Это чрезвычайно важная вещь.
And it's the foundation of the resolution of many crucial problems, including the health of the nation. It's impossible to solve the healthcare problems of millions of people only by using pills. People need to have the habits or passion, or there even has to be a fashion of healthy lifestyle, of sports. So I believe that this is a right thing when not only I, but other colleagues like heads of government, ministries, and legislators of the State Duma, when, as today, for example, they participate in the two distance marathon races, when they attend soccer matches, when they participate in sports competitions themselves. So this is, well, including from This is where the love of millions of people of sports comes from.
Не только, но в том числе зарождается интерес или любовь миллионов людей к занятиям физической культурой и спорту. Я считаю, что
I think it's extremely important.
May I suggest, I hear you, and that is important. But may I suggest also you do like the image that you present, bare-chested, on horseback, as a strong leader. That's who you want to be seen as, for your people and for the world.
Я хочу, чтобы
I want everybody to know that Russia as a whole, and the leadership of Russia in particular, are something effective and properly functioning.
И должным образом функционирующее, что это все вместе и сама страна,
That altogether, Russia, both the country itself and these institutions, its leaders, are healthy people, competent people, who are ready to cooperate with our partners wherever they are, whether in the fields of sports, politics, or cooperation in the fight against these threats. I think that there is only positive in this.
Well, it's appropriate to believe that you would believe in a strong leader because you believe in a strong central government, and you've suggested what happens when you don't have that. Are you curious about America? More than simply another nation that you have to deal with? Because they're curious about you, as I suggested. Are you curious? Are you watching the Republican political debates?
Well, I wouldn't say I watch them daily, no. But of course we're curious about what's going on in the U.S. It's a major world power, an economic and military leader. So, of course, America exerts great influence on the situation in the world in general. And of course, we're interested in what's going on. And we keep a close watch, but I don't watch the internal political saga on an everyday basis. I'd say more likely no.
Yeah. Because if you watch that, I mean, it's Donald Trump says, you know who he is. He said he would like to meet you because he thinks the two of you would get along. And Donald Trump.
Да, я слышал, да, я слышал. Ну, мы будем рады.
Yeah, I heard that. Well, we'll be glad to have any contact with the next president of the United States. Any person who gains the trust of the American people can count on the fact that we will work with him.
Marco Rubio is running for the Republican nomination, and he said some terrible things about you. You know, this is political debate and in a political campaign. I understand. He said that you were like a gangster. He was attacking you because he wanted to have an attacking Russia.
How can I be a gangster if I worked for the KGB? That simply has no basis in reality.
What do you admire most about America?
Творческий подход к решению.
I like the creativity. Creativity when it comes to your tackling problems. Their openness, because it allows them to unleash the inner potential of their people. And thanks to that, America has attained such great results in developing their country.
Потрясающих успехов в развитии в своем развитии.
Russia had Sputnik. You were there before the United States. Russia has extraordinary astrophysicists. Russia has extraordinary leaders in medicine and in science and in physics. I mean, do you hope that what you can do is restore that leadership and create the same kind of innovation that you just admired America for? And how will you do that?
Нам нужно не утратить то, что было создано за предыдущие десятилетия.
We shouldn't lose what was created in the previous decades, and we should create the very conditions for showing the potential of our people, because we're a very talented people. We have a very good basis, which you mentioned. You said that you love Russian culture. I think that's a great basis for internal development. You've just mentioned our achievements in science and many other areas. We must support that. We must create conditions for people to develop freely, for them to feel confident that they're able to realize their potential. And I'm confident that we will have an effect on the consistent development of science, of high-tech technologies, and of the economy in the country overall.
In America, the Supreme Court, as you know, there's been some controversy here about gay rights. In America, the Supreme Court declared it a constitutional right for same-sex marriage. Do you applaud America and the court for doing that? You think that's a good idea, to make it a constitutional right for same-sex marriage?
Вы знаете, это неоднородная группа людей.
Well, you know, I think that's not a homogeneous group of people. Some representatives of the non-traditional sexual orientation, for example, speak out against the adoption of children by such couples. They themselves are against it. So, do you think these people are less democratic than other representatives of this community, this gay community, who support child adoption by gay couples? Most likely not. But that's simply their take on the issue. The problem of sexual minorities in Russia has been deliberately exaggerated from the outside for political reasons. I believe without any good reason. We don't have any such problem.
Okay, help us understand.
Well, I'll explain it for you. It's well known that in 4 states in America, homosexual orientation is a crime. Whether that's good or bad isn't the issue. We know there's a ruling of the Supreme Court, but this problem has not disappeared. It's not completely removed from American legislation, but we don't have that.
So you would condemn that?
Yes, I condemn that. I believe that there should not be any criminal prosecution or any other prosecution or infringement of people's rights on the basis of their race, ethnicity, religious, or sexual orientation. That should be excluded in the modern world.
Вот у нас этого и нет. У нас была, если мне память не изменяет, в Уголовном кодексе РСФСР 120-я статья.
If my memory doesn't fail me, we had Article 120 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR, which had prosecutions on the basis of homosexuality. We've abolished all of that. We have no persecution at all. People of non-traditional sexual orientation live in peace. They work, they get promoted, they get state awards for their achievements in science and the arts and other areas. They receive medals. I personally have awarded them medals. But this is what the question was: a ban on propaganda of homosexuality among minors. I don't see anything undemocratic in this legal act. I only proceed from the fact that we should leave children in peace. We should give them a chance to grow, to realize who they are, and to decide for themselves. Who is this person? What does he consider himself to be? A man or a woman? Do they want to live in a normal, natural marriage or a non-traditional one? That's all. I simply don't observe here any infringement of the rights of people of non-traditional sexual orientation. I believe this has been a deliberate exaggeration with the purpose of making a group of people from Russia, for the purpose of making an enemy of Russia, for political considerations. I believe this is one of the lines of attack against Russia.
From where?
From the side of those who do that. Look and see who does this.
So you're saying that as far as you're concerned, there is as much a recognition for gay rights and gay marriage as there is in the United States. That's your position.
We do not only recognize, but we ensure their rights. In Russia, equal rights are guaranteed for everyone, including for people of non-traditional sexual orientation.
Ukraine. You and I have talked about Ukraine before. Many believe that as a result of what happened in Ukraine and Crimea, the United States and the West imposed sanctions. And those sanctions have hurt Russia. And that you believe by reemerging and in trying to be a positive force around the world and in Syria, that it might somehow lessen the focus on Ukraine.
Не очень. Чтобы отвлечь внимание от украинской
So do you mean that will help to somehow distract the attention from the Ukrainian crisis?
Yes.
So our actions in Syria are aimed at distracting? Is that what you mean? No. Ukraine is a separate and major issue for us. Syria is a different issue. And I told you why. We don't want the disintegration of Syria. We don't want the return of terrorists and of those who engage in warfare coming back to Russia. So there's a whole complexity of problems. When it comes to Ukraine, that's a separate issue. It's our closest neighbor. We've always said that it's our brother country. It's not only the Slavs. Our languages are very similar. We have common history, common culture, common religion, and many things in common. What I believe is absolutely inadmissible is the resolution of internal political issues in the former USSR republics through color revolutions, through coup d'etat, through unconstitutional removal of power.
Переворотов и неконституционным способом смещения власти действующей. Вот это абсолютно неприемлемо.
That is totally unacceptable. Our partners in the United States have supported those who ousted Yanukovych.
You believe that the United States had something to do with the ousting of Yanukovych and he had to flee to Russia.
I know that for sure. I know those people who live in Ukraine. We have thousands of contacts with them. We know where and when, and who met with someone, and who worked with those who ousted Yanukovych, how they were supported, how much they were paid, how they were trained, where, in which countries, and who those instructors were. We know everything. And our American partners don't try to conceal that anyway. They said, yes, well, we did. We did train them. And we spent that much money. And it amounts to $5 billion. So there's no secret about it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're suggesting that this...
Nobody's even arguing against that.
You respect the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Sure, but we want other countries to respect the sovereignty of other countries and Ukraine in particular. Respect for sovereignty means to not allow unconstitutional action and coup d'etat, the removal of legitimate power.
How will that
is something that should not be...
How will the renewal of legitimate power take place in your judgment? How will that come about? And what role will Russia play?
Россия никогда не принимает и не собирается принимать участие в действиях, направленных на...
Russia has not taken part and is not going to take part in any actions aimed at removing the legitimate government.
То результат очень тяжелый.
What I'm saying is that somebody does that. The result is very difficult to deal with. In Libya, we've seen the disintegration of the state. In Iraq, we've seen the territory's been filled with terrorists. In Syria, the situation is unfolding the same way. In Afghanistan, you very well know what the situation looks like. What happened in Ukraine? The coup d'etat led to a civil war. Many citizens of Ukraine did not have trust in Yanukovych, that's true. But they should have gone to the elections and elected a new leader, not commit the removal of power. But after the coup d'etat, somebody supported that, somebody liked it, but somebody did not. And those who did not like it were treated from the position of force.
Начали разговаривать с позиции силы. Результат – гражданская война.
I repeat, what are you prepared to do?
Let me tell you, if your question is about that, I believe Russia and other international actors, those who are more actively engaged in the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, I mean Germany and France, the so-called Normandy Four, of course with the active engagement of the United States. And in that direction, we have intensified our dialogue in this sphere. We all should strive for full and unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements must be fulfilled.
Полному и безусловному исполнению тех договоренностей, которые достигнуты были в Минске. Надо исполнять Минские договоренности.
But that's exactly what John Kerry said yesterday, coming out of a meeting with the British foreign minister. He mentioned after Syria, Ukraine. And he said, we have to have a full implementation of the Minsk agreements. So you and John Kerry are just like this. You agree. Implement the Minsk agreement.
In full. In full. Could you please have enough patience and not interrupt me for 2 minutes? And I ask you to please present this without cuts. Can you do this? Do you have enough power to do this, to present it without cuts?
Yes.
Исполнение Минских соглашений означает, там несколько пунктов, я скажу о главном.
The implementation of the Minsk agreements means there are several articles, but I'll speak about the main point so that the situation in Ukraine changes fundamentally. There should be political reform. That's first. There should be constitutional changes. That's what's set forth in the Minsk agreements. Then, most important, the Minsk agreements state this should be done in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. And that is a matter of principle. Ukraine, there are reforms introduced in the constitution in the first reading, but there's been no coordination with Luhansk and Donetsk at all, and no one even intends to coordinate anything with them. That's point one. Point two, it's stated in the Minsk agreements that there should be the implementation of the law. The law was already passed in Ukraine of the special self-governance status of those territories. They've adopted this law. Its implementation has been postponed. That means that the Minsk agreements are not fulfilled on this point. And third, there should have been the amnesty law. How can one engage in a dialogue with people from Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk if they're all being prosecuted? They're all being brought legal charges against them. That's why the Minsk agreements say that a law on amnesty must be adopted, but it's not been adopted. And there are other points as well. For example, conducting local elections. It's been written in the Minsk agreements to adopt a law on local elections upon coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine has adopted the law on local elections. The representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk sent their proposals on this law 3 times, but nobody even talked to them. The Minsk agreements say, with coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. That's why I respect and love Mr. Kerry. He's an extremely experienced diplomat, very experienced diplomat. He told me that he was against Star Wars back in the past, and it was the right thing to do. Because maybe if he was the one who adopted decisions on ABM, we probably wouldn't have any conflicts on ABM right now. But if one side says, we've done this, that, and that, we've complied with the Minsk agreements, it's not true. Because all these points must be implemented in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. There has been no coordination so far. As for the implementation of the already adopted law on the special self-governance of these territories, the Minsk agreements say within 30 days. Nothing has been done yet. It's been postponed. The entering into force of this law has been postponed. That's why we advocate the full and unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements by both sides, not as interpreted by one of the sides, but as it's written down in the Minsk agreements.
You really believe that?
There's nothing to believe, actually. It's written on paper. You just need to read it. It's written in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Read the document for yourself. And I'm telling you, there has been no coordination at all. It was written to adopt the law on the special status within 30 days. But the law has not been enforced. So who's not implementing the Minsk agreements?
You've mentioned the Secretary of State. He also said that it's important not only to implement the Minsk agreement, but also for separatists to give up the idea of independent elections. John Kerry said that yesterday.
Well, yes, I know the position of our U.S. friends, and here's what I want to say in this regard. I just mentioned this. I see I'm forced to repeat it. The Minsk agreements say that a law on local elections must be passed in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. So what happened in reality? The Kiev authorities did adopt the law on their own without any coordination or negotiations with Donetsk and Luhansk, in spite of the fact that Donetsk and Luhansk sent their draft 3 times. There was no dialogue at all. They've adopted this on their own without any consultations. Moreover, the law that was adopted by Kiev says that in these territories there will not be elections at all. How are we to understand this? In fact, they themselves have provoked the representative of Donetsk and Luhansk to schedule their own elections. That's all there is to it.
Okay.
So we're ready together with Mr. Kerry to discuss all of this, but we need to prod both sides to implement what they've put their signatures to, rather than to pass off as something good what they've done on their own initiative.
I hear you, but I wanted to repeat that because Secretary Kerry emphasized separatist elections. I did hear you. Here is what I think.
Well, he's being cunning. As Secretary of State and as a diplomat, he's being cunning. It's quite normal for his profession and for his work. All diplomats are quite cunning. So is he.
You would never do that, would you?
No, I would never do that. I'm not a diplomat.
What are you? How do you see yourself?
I'm a human being. I'm a citizen of the Russian Federation. I'm a Russian.
You also have said that the worst thing that happened last century was the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There are those who look at Ukraine, especially Ukraine and Georgia, and they believe that you do not want to recreate the Soviet Empire, but you do want to recreate a sphere of influence which you think Russia deserves because of the relationship that has existed. Why are you smiling? Why?
You're making me happy because we're always suspected of some ambitions, and they always try to distort something or hint at something. I indeed said that I believe that the collapse of the USSR was a huge tragedy of the 20th century. You know why? Because first of all, in a single instant, 25 million Russian people found themselves beyond the borders of the Russian Federation. Here they had been living within the borders of a unified state, and always traditionally the Soviet Union had been called Russia, Soviet Russia. Well, this was greater Russia. Then all of a sudden the USSR collapsed, just overnight, in fact, right? And it's turned out that in former Soviet republics there were people, Russian people, numbering 25 million. They had been living in a single country, and all of a sudden they turned out to be abroad. You can imagine how many problems arose. First of all, there were everyday problems, economic problems, social problems, the separation of families. You can't list them all. Do you think it's normal that 25 million people, Russian people, wound up abroad all of a sudden? Russians turned out to be the largest divided nation in the world today. Is that not a problem? Well, not for you, but it's a problem for me.
And what do you intend to do about it?
What we want to do is use modern civilized processes to preserve, at least at a minimum, the common humanitarian space, to make it so that these state borders do not get in the way, so that people can communicate freely among themselves, so that we can develop our economies jointly. We want to take advantage of those benefits of the former USSR that we've inherited. What are these benefits? Joint infrastructure, a unified railroad system, a unified highway system, a unified energy system, and finally, if I dare say it, the great Russian language which unites all former republics of the Soviet Union and which gives us evident competitive advantages when promoting various integration projects in the territory of the post-Soviet space. You've probably heard that we first established the Customs Union and then we've transformed it into the Eurasian Economic Union. So when people can communicate freely and move freely, when workforces, goods, services, and capital move freely, there are no state lines when we have our common rules and legal regulation in the social sphere, for example. Then this is quite enough. People must feel free.
But do you have to use and show military force to accomplish that objective?
No, of course not.
You have a military presence on the border of Ukraine, and some even argue that there have been Russian troops in Ukraine.
Well, you have a military presence in Europe.
Yes.
The tactical nuclear weapons of the United States are in Europe. Let's not forget that. What does that mean? Does it mean that you've occupied Germany, or that you renounced the occupation of Germany after World War II, and then you have only transformed the occupation forces into NATO forces? One could put it that way, but we're not putting it that way. And if we have our military forces on our border, on our territory, on the border with some state, you believe this is a crime?
I didn't say a crime.
Well, in order to run these activities that I've told you about, this economic, humanitarian, and social integration, military force would not be needed at all. We've built our customs union, the Eurasian Economic Union, not with the use of force, but through seeking a compromise. This is a complicated process, a difficult, long-standing process, through negotiations and through the search for a compromise on mutually beneficial and acceptable conditions, with the exception that we would create for our people and for our economies more effective advantages in world markets and in the international arena in general.
So while we're talking about this, tell me about the Baltic states and your intentions towards the Baltic states.
Well, we'd like to build friendly relations with them. There are a lot of Russian people living there who remained after the Soviet Union. They're violated there. Their rights have been violated. You know that in many Baltic states, they have invented some new thing in international law. This has been the case up until now regarding citizenship. A citizen, a foreigner, a person without citizenship, and dual nationals, that is, people with dual citizenship.
без гражданства и бипатриды, то есть люди с двойным гражданством. В прибалтийских республиках
The Baltic states have invented something totally new. You know what they call them? They call them non-citizens.
Не гражданами называют.
They call people who have been living for decades in the territory of the Baltic states and who have been deprived of a whole number of political rights. They cannot take part in elections. Their political and social rights are restricted. And everyone keeps silent about this, as if this is the way it's supposed to be. And of course, this cannot help but provoke an appropriate response. But I proceed from the fact that our colleagues both in the US and the European Union will base on today's principles of humanitarian law and will proceed from modern principles of humanitarian law and will ensure the political liberties and rights for all people. Including for those people who are living in the territory of Baltic states after the collapse of the USSR. But when it comes to economic ties, we have stable, very developed contracts with these countries. You know, but there are some things, how can I put this more delicately, that bother me and make me sad. We're all talking about the need to have a rapprochement, to bring our positions closer, about the need to integrate economically, politically. So, as for the Baltic states, we had a single energy system. So the Baltic states were naturally part of this common power system of the Soviet Union. Now, what are they doing? Everyone's talking about rapprochement, Russia and the European Union. What actually happens in practice now is that they plan to remove the Baltic states from this unified energy system of the former Soviet Union and hook them up to the European system. So what does that mean for us in practice? It means that among some of our regions in the Russian Federation, there will be some zones where there will be no electric power lines. Because before it went through the Baltic countries. And so it means that, once again, spending billions of US dollars, this system must be built from scratch, just as our European partners will have to spend billions of dollars to hook up the Baltic states to their energy grid. Why? Why, when we're striving for some sort of joint work and integration, not in words, but in practice? Why do this? And this is what's happening along many lines. They say one thing, but they do something quite different. I think that this all comes from growing pains, and I believe that common sense will finally prevail, if not here, on other issues. We're all interested in developing openly without any prejudice. The Baltic states above all, and for them, this is more important for them than Russia itself. Take one of the countries, Lithuania, for instance, in the Soviet era. Do you know what the population was? 3.4 million people. And now, I checked the latest references, 1.4 million. Where did the people go?
Down.
In that country, yes. Over half the citizens left the country. Can you imagine what would happen if half the American population left the U.S.? It would be a disaster. What does that tell us? That tells us that the links that were lost, above all in the economy, have a negative impact on us, and on Russia as well. That's why I'm deeply convinced that we should abandon the phobias of the past. We should look ahead and act based on the international law to build good neighborly relations on an equal footing.
And eliminate sanctions.
Well, if someone likes to work so much through using sanctions, go ahead, you can do that. But it's harmful. It goes against international law, as I've mentioned, first of all. And secondly, tell me where the policy of imposing sanctions has been effective. Nowhere, especially with regard to a country like Russia.
Even your friends worry about the Russian economy because of sanctions first, but also declining oil prices. You know, is that a huge challenge for you? Is that a troubling global economic reality?
You know, as I said, sanctions are illegal actions which violate the principles of the world economy, the principles of the WTO, the United Nations, because sanctions can be introduced only by the decision of the UN Security Council, because unilaterally that is a violation of international law. Well, let's leave it aside. Of course sanctions are harmful. But they're not the main reason for the slump in the growth of the Russian economy or other problems related to inflation. The main reason for us really is the drop in prices on the world market for our traditional export commodities, such as oil and gas and some other goods.
Вот это главное. Но санкции, они, конечно, добавляют сюда.
When it comes to sanctions, they add to the negative side. They do have an influence one way or another, although they don't have a capital, fundamental importance for our economy.
You can survive sanctions.
Это само собой, это даже...
Well, that goes without saying, no doubt. It's beyond discussion.
Есть даже определенный плюс.
There's even a certain positive side to it. Do you know what the advantage is? It's many things, especially when it comes to high technologies. We used to prefer to buy them, to use our petrodollars. But now, since these sanctions are imposed, we either can't buy these technologies, or we fear that something may be closed off to us, and now we're forced to introduce entire programs for developing our own high-tech economy in industry, manufacturing, and science. And that's in fact something we would have to do anyway. But it was difficult for us before because our own domestic markets were flooded with foreign goods. So in the WTO, it was difficult to support our local manufacturers. But now that the sanctions have been imposed, our partners have voluntarily left our market. Now we have a chance for development.
Let me have two more questions first.
Of course, you have the floor.
You've been president, prime minister, president. How long do you want to serve? And what do you want to be your legacy? One question.
Это зависит, как долго, зависит от двух обстоятельств.
Well, how long? That depends on two things. First of all, unquestionably, there are regulations provided for by the Constitution, and they'll never be violated by me for certain. But I'm not sure that I should fully exercise all these constitutional rights. That'll depend on the specific situation in the country and the world, well, on my own sentiments about it.
And what do you want your legacy to be?
That Russia should be effective, competitive, should have a sustainable economy, with a developed social and political system that is flexible, both in regard to changes within and around the country.
And should play a major role in the world that it lives.
It should be competitive, as I said, and should be in a position to defend its own interests and to influence those processes which are significant to it.
Many say you're all-powerful here in Russia. Many say you're all-powerful. And they believe that you can have anything you want. Anything. What do you want? Tell America, tell the world what Vladimir Putin wants.
I want for Russia to be as I've just described it. That's really my main desire. I want people to be happy, and that our partners all over the world would want to and would strive to develop relations with Russia.
Thank you.
That was part two of our conversation with President Putin, which took place in Moscow on September 20th. We now talk about what happened at the United Nations General Assembly. President Obama and President Putin spoke at the UNGA on Monday. They met afterwards in their first formal meeting in 2 years. President Putin called that discussion, quote, surprisingly very frank. Joining us now from Washington, Stephen Lee Myers of the New York Times. He spent 7 years as the newspaper's Moscow correspondent. He is the author of the new book, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. From CBS in New York is CBS News foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. Here in New York, Carol Lee. She is a White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Also in New York, Neil Ferguson, a professor of history at Harvard. I'm pleased to have all of them here. Neil Ferguson's first volume history, memoir or biography it is, of Henry Kissinger has just been published. It is called Henry Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealist. Carol, you've been following the story. Mm-hmm. Exactly what happened?
They saw each other at a lunch. Putin made a grand entrance in the middle of Ban Ki-moon's speech and sat at the table where the president was, and they clinked champagne glasses at the end of the Secretary General's speech, and then they went into a private meeting, which lasted 90 minutes. And, you know, I've covered this president for 6 years, and I've covered other meetings that he's had with Vladimir Putin. And this was the first time that the U.S. officials came out of that meeting and felt like they weren't arguing about the terms of what the problem is. You know, that often happened with Ukraine in particular. They were more arguing about how to approach the problem.
Margaret, what can you add to what we may know from the American side of this meeting between the two leaders?
Well, you know, Putin himself was only in the country for about 7 hours. It was very much, I'm here, I'm making a statement, and I'm leaving. And it's interesting, when you ask U.S. officials and they don't want to answer a question on Russia, their favorite tagline, talking point is always, it's hard to get inside Putin's head. And I think that's really what sums up what this meeting was about. I mean, this meeting with the president and Vladimir Putin went on far longer than many expected. And it really has stalled U.S. policy in many ways up to this point, because people wanted to see what is Putin going to put on the table. And from what I'm hearing, he didn't put much concrete offer on the table, at least not the way that there were expectations raised in terms of hearing his vision for exactly what to do in Syria. He raised a concept, but he didn't give a proposal.
How did you see the way Putin played this?
He played it astonishingly well. Here we find ourselves in a situation that Russia is now apparently the broker of peace in Syria. Now, that's an extraordinary turn of events, and it's a sign of how clever Putin is, that he's able to do this from a position of extreme economic weakness. Yeah. Not only the sanctions, but the oil price collapse have really hit the Russian economy hard, and yet he's come to New York, apparently the power broker, and I find that an amazing achievement, and frankly a rather sad reflection on the nous of our president.
Stephen, what do you think his objectives are here?
A lot of people have looked at this as some sort of game or brinkmanship, that Putin has somehow achieved a victory over Obama or what have you. There's no question that he's put Russia into the center of the discussion, but I think it's way too soon to say that he's achieved anything by that. If you look at what they're doing in Syria right now, they're very concerned about the fate of their biggest ally in the region. And they've been involved in Syria from the beginning of this war. And I think that the reason you're seeing the buildup, the military involvement, is a sign of not strength, but fear and weakness, that the Assad government is in danger of falling, and that the reaction has been to build that up.
Talking to people in the administration before I went to see Putin about where they stood, you know, that they have changed. Margaret, help me understand where John Kerry is on the question of Assad, because he's had a long relationship with Assad.
He has. He's been to the country. He's negotiated with Bashar al-Assad directly. And arguably, he is the one who has this assignment of figuring out what to do put on his desk, and has been pushed hard to get more done. A lot of what's being done here in New York is what you might call small ball, in terms of pushing the Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, to help agree to small-scale ceasefires in Syria through UN auspices, also limiting some of the instruments of death, so to speak, that Assad uses, specifically the barrel bombs that he's dropping on civilians. This is the level of request that they're actually negotiating over right now. They are not place of talking Assad out of power. In fact, the United States has been sitting down with the Saudi foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister to talk about who might be in that next transition government. But when they say transition, they're not talking about Assad exiting on day one. In fact, you've heard some say Assad wouldn't exit until ISIS is defeated. And as you know from U.S. officials and military assessments, we are years off possibly from that happening. So there's negotiation over that time frame of when he'd walk out.
I've been an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin. I once compared him to Michael Corleone in a Time magazine article, so I'm no fan. But if this had been a debating contest, Putin would have won it hands down at the UN General Assembly. Because what did President Obama say? He spent part of his speech criticizing Iran, and then part of his speech criticizing Russia, and then he concluded by saying, could they please help him sort out Syria? And even more extraordinarily, he said at one point that we had left a vacuum of power in Libya by getting rid of Gaddafi, though he didn't mention him by name. And then he concluded his speech by saying we needed to get rid of Assad in Syria. I mean, the holes in the argument are absolutely enormous. Putin's position was a simpler one. We allowed states to disintegrate in North Africa and the Middle East, and this has had desperate consequences, and you can't really argue with him about that.
Just from the standpoint of whether there is working room for these two countries to find some place to attack ISIS. And the other question that's on the table for me is, has the Assad regime had any success in fighting ISIS, and have they been focused on fighting ISIS?
Well, the White House's hope in terms of whether they can reach some sort of an agreement with Russia on this is that Vladimir Putin is not wedded to Assad the person, but the Assad regime, and in that sense
or a sovereign government,
right? And in that sense that they can negotiate some kind of agreement where he steps down in several years, most likely. That's increasingly the way that they're explaining it.
And everybody's prepared, they think, to accept that idea that he can be in power as much as 2 or 3 years, as long as we're making progress by getting rid of ISIS.
Well, the hope is that they can spin it in a way or set it up structure it in a way that outlines a plan that sends the message that he is on the way out, or effectively a lame duck. The interesting thing about all of this is that what this Russia's intervention has done is you've had this president deal with the fight against Islamic State and the civil war in Syria, and the White House officials have always described that as parallel tracks. And what you're seeing now is what Russia's intervention and moves in Syria has forced them to do is to bring this under one full umbrella and try to come up with some sort of comprehensive strategy, which is what the president's critics have been calling for him to do for quite some time.
But this comes at the same time the administration is acknowledging huge failure in supporting.
That's the other element, is that they've had huge failures in their approach to the Islamic State, and obviously failures in their approach to handling the civil war. And now he's looking for a way out. And look, every president has a major crisis that hangs over them, and this is Barack Obama's, and he only has a year and change left, and it's unclear whether he can really change the dynamics on the ground there in that short amount of time.
Stephen Lee Myers, I want you to bring this back. Tell us who he is.
Even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were suggestions that he understood the essential corruption of the system, the stagnation of the system. But he wants very much to restore the greatness of the state, at least the Russian state, on the level that he knew growing up as a young man, and that gives him this incredible devotion and loyalty to the state power. It's in his blood from his service in the KGB, his understanding of what makes a country powerful, and especially a country like Russia. Is the central security of the state and the strength of the institutions of it. To him, that's much more important than values of democracy or freedom of speech and so forth. And when you look at the experience that Russia went through after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he considers it his great accomplishment that he's been able to restore the stability of the state, turn around the economy, essentially begin a transition to a new Russia. And when he sees what the United States has done, it's essentially, in his mind, having replaced the bipolar world of the Cold War with a unilateral power, the hegemon, the one country. And he talked about that quite strikingly during surrounding his remarks in New York. And I think he's trying to say that the world needs to go back to the order that recognizes the power, the great powers like Russia, like China, and not just the single superpower. And so when he looks at the events in Iraq under President Bush and continuing today, the invasion of Afghanistan and what's happening, he sees the Americans throwing their weight around the world, and that has led to chaos because they've essentially not respected Russia's importance in these discussions.
Stephen Lemar's book is called The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Thank you very much. Neil Ferguson's new book, Kissinger, 1923-1960, The Idealist. Margaret Brennan, thank you for taking time for us.
Thank you, Charlie. And I will say, one thing this all does, this makes John Kerry's job that much harder to keep any kind of anti-ISIS coalition together. The Arab states are not happy about the U.S. getting any closer or coordinating in any way with Russia.
And especially Iran, too.
Exactly.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Carol, thank you. It's
Thank
great to
you.
have you here.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time. For more about this program and early episodes, visit us online at pbs.org and charlierose.com.